Good morning and welcome to the second part of our Workforce Webisode, looking at the wage data trend that emerged from the 2016 census. I'm Susan Laycock, Executive Director of the Simcoe Muskoka Workforce Development Board, and once again we are happy to welcome our Project Manager Rob Shepard, working behind the scenes, as well as noted labor market analyst Tom Zizys. Good morning, Tom.
Good morning.
Tom, last week in addition to the wage data from the 2016 census, you touched on some of the factors affecting wage levels, some of which are expected while others are not. Can you remind us of what those were before we dig into this week's discussion about future trends?
Sure. Yeah. Wages obviously are related to occupations, but even within the same occupation, we see variations. Those variations can depend on where the job is, geography, depends on the gender of the person. Males and females, even doing the same jobs, often don't get paid the same amount as is known. Age, because age is often also a reflection of experience. So there are a number of factors that come into play. But as you mentioned, Susan, some of those are explainable and some of those are not. And I think it's always important to recognize that wages are affected by other factors that are not always understandable, and the gender one is a good example. And I think what I want to try and talk through today is identify where in some instances there is a rationale for a particular wage and where there isn't, and what are some of the things we can do to kind of align wages so they are rational, they are related to kind of economic principles. So I wanted to start with an example, going to the whole issue of skill shortages. So we know employers for years have been talking about skill shortages. Back in 2014, it's interesting, the Federal Parliamentary Budget Office, they did a study. It was an economic study driven by data to try and analyze and quantify what this skill shortage was about. And what they determined was there, in fact, wasn't a skill shortage. There was perhaps in isolated geographic areas, like at that time in the oil patch, among certain skilled trades, there was a shortage. But overall, they felt there wasn't a skill shortage, and their reasoning was because there was no increase in wages. Said the economics principles would state that in the case of supply and demand, if there's a shortage of supply, there's a large demand, that prices will increase, and wages are a price. And they're saying we're not seeing wages increase, and so we don't think there's a skill shortage. And yet, it was pretty clear when you're doing surveys or focus groups or interviews with employers, they were very sincere about the challenge they felt in finding qualified workers. So the question was, well, what's really going on? Are employers acting rationally, or are they not acting rationally? So I like to try and explain this in terms of two levels. There's a big picture, and there's what's happening with individual employers. The big picture has to do with the broader economy, has to do with business models and practices of employers, and also our own social norms of what we accept as in terms of fairness and so on. But also individual employers. There's not a single model that describes how employers might make their choices or decisions around issues like wages. So let's go to the big picture. Now, what I'm going to try and describe on the big picture here is really more about what's happened over the last 20 or 30 years. It's probably something that warrants around a 30-minute discussion, but I'm going to try and squeeze this into a few minutes. Since around the 1970s, we started having a significant change in terms of how our economy operates. One of the items that I think is really important is how finances took over. Companies before were far more interested in growth in terms of market share. And starting in the 70s, the stock market and what the return on investment was became really important. And that had a bearing because companies started looking far more to short-term results. We keep hearing about quarterly returns that a certain company meet the market expectations. That really only started in the 70s. They started focusing on short-term thinking, started looking at what they would call efficiency, but oftentimes it was cost-cutting, and they're looking on that return on investment. Okay, that focus on financing also meant there was a fair amount of effort put into restructuring. We started seeing companies being bought and sold, hostile takeovers, mergers, acquisitions, all those terms which we hear so much now in the news. They become part of our culture. Really started emerging much more in the 70s and then through the 80s, which meant that we've reached a stage, for example, now where we have in almost every sector a smaller number of dominant firms and then a large number of all the rest. Okay, and those dominant firms can often set the stage in terms of prices, in terms of wages, in terms of there being less competition, and in terms of sometimes even more difficult for other companies to break into that field. Okay, what does that mean? Well, so the consequences on the next page is it really has affected how we all operate, not only employers but also and employees, because we all feel this constraint of time, we feel this constraint of resources. We're often having to deal with short-term calculations because we don't even know if the company we're working with is going to be around. We don't even know if we're still going to have a job. So employers have tended to place less investment in training. They have fewer staff in supervisory positions, so they expect employees to be functioning more on their own. So job candidates have to be far more job ready than they ever were. On the other hand, there's more expectation of the job, that the skills required of a job, even an entry-level job, are higher than before. But when it comes to recruitment, we also set the bar higher in terms of screening for candidates by actually setting up requirements for credentials that may not necessarily be required for that job. So we're creating these expectations that are very difficult to meet for many individuals. On the other hand, employers are also being quite risk averse. They're worried about taking on an individual who's going to be part of their workforce for many years because they're not sure how they're going to work out. They're not sure what the business demand's going to be like. So they hold back on full employment and look to other alternatives like more precarious employment, which just makes it more difficult for everyone else. Finally, that whole picture in terms of the short-term emphasis on short-term thinking, less training, more precarious employment, has actually meant that we're less productive as an economy. And it's productivity, it's the growth in productivity that is what drives wage increases. Okay, so it's a long explanation to explain how we've actually kind of created this downward cycle of putting pressure on costs, including keeping wages low, but that has also affected our productivity growth, in my view, and the view of many others, and which is one of the reasons why wages have often stayed flat. Okay. So, in that circumstance, what are employers being told? Number one, they're being told they should be doing more training. Okay. Secondly, they're being told that with unemployment getting lower, that there is going to be shortages of workers, and so they should be looking to other demographic categories like newcomers or more women or individuals who are further from the labor market, trying to engage them more into the labor force. Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. All right. We know, for example, from the studies that when employers do training, there are many benefits. There's an increase in job retention, so they don't have to constantly go out and hire more people. There's an increase in satisfaction on the part of employees. They're more engaged in their work. There's less absenteeism. There's fewer accidents. There's fewer mistakes. So, in short, again, perfectly rational suggestion to do more training. We know the evidence points to it producing better results, The question is, why don't employers do more training? So this next slide, I've listed from the literature all the different reasons why employers may not do training, because in fact oftentimes they do have good reasons. They may not have the information. They're not certain of what the business literature might be saying about the return on investment of training. They may not be sure what kind of training, who should make that assessment, who should deliver the training. The benefits of the training are something that may happen over the course of 6 or 12 months, but the cost of the training is something that is immediate. And who's going to pay for it? Do they have the cash flow right now? Do they have managers who are good at delivering the training? Do they have the right people in HR who can identify who the appropriate training provider should be? So there's a whole bunch of issues that employers actually could benefit from getting some assistance on in order to actually engage in that training. So in the next slide, what I mention is a couple of items that I think are really relevant, particularly to employment service providers and to employers and to others involved in the labor market in Simcoe and Muskoka. It warrants employers getting help with information, letting them know about how they might overcome some of the barriers that they feel around training, knowing who the training providers are, what I call overcoming the transactional costs. They may not, if we're all under this pressure of time constraints and funding and so on, we have sources of where individuals, where organizations can help employers around some of these training challenges. Those are often called intermediaries. So they're the go-between between the supply and demand. Your workforce planning board is a labor market intermediary. That's your function, is to kind of assist employers to link them up with those resources that exist in the local community.
Or even devise projects and tools for them to help them through that process. That's right.
And so, like, even though we have this view that everything now is market driven, in fact the market is so almost chaotic that it benefits from having those kinds of players who can be that resource for employers. It's not as if employers don't need those resources. They actually need them now more than ever because the economy's so in such flux and is constantly innovating and constantly changing. It's why we focus on specific sectors when we talk about workforce development. We say, we should focus on manufacturing, or we should focus on transportation and warehousing, for example, because we need to make sure we establish that expertise in each particular area, because each industry has different standards, it has different trends, there's occupations are changing in different ways, technology is impacting that industry, and so it takes some time to actually develop that kind of expertise to be able to be that resource to the employer community. One of the things I think we don't do enough of is we don't clarify or draw out from employers what their current costs are by not doing training. Mm-hmm. So when employers talk about the lack of skilled workers, what they are doing is they're either foregoing business, or they're using their current workforce and having to pay much more overtime, or they're using temp agencies, or they're having their supervisors work extra on weekends. All those are a cost. They're actually spending money because they can't find the right workers, but they might be hesitant to engage workers and train them because they think it's a cost. Well, the cost is actually already being spent. And so or more, yeah. And so part of the kind of advocacy work that's also involved here is quantifying some of those costs. Similarly, when we talked about the transition into employment, we have a whole network of employment service providers, both Employment Ontario and through the social services that exist in Simcoe and Muskoka. It's really, I think, it's quite astonishing how many employers don't know about those services. So these are services that are there available for employers to help them recruit to meet their job openings. That being said, for a number of occupations, especially entry occupations, when we talk about targeting underutilized segments of the population, these are segments that often do require some help to transition if they're individuals with barriers to employment, they need some support. If they're newcomers, they need some acclimatization to Canadian practices and so on. There was an article in the New York Times just last week I found kind of interesting, where the headline was, "To get a better job, first train for the job training." That in fact what they're saying is that even to get into job training, you first needed some preliminary preparation for, again, these are for individuals who might be disadvantaged in terms of the job market. So pre-employment programs are very important, emphasizing employability skills and literacy skills, soft skills, the kind of things that are provided through your Soft Skills Solutions program, for example. We don't invest enough in job retention support. I know it's a requirement, but by and large, most of our efforts are placed on the job matching, but job retention that not only offers kind of job coaching to the new employee, but also provides some coaching to the employer. I think a lot of employers will find that some of their supervisors and managers could probably benefit from some HR support. So I guess where I'm going with this, and in the next slide, I want to try and emphasize that these are complex issues and they require very complex solutions. They're not, each of us performing our different functions around our own responsibilities is not enough. We need integrated approaches. We need integrated strategies.
Yes.
And again, I go back to organizations like the Workforce Planning Board are very important because they are the conveners. It's not that you do it all, but it's important to bring together a lot of different stakeholders. And those stakeholders are not always only the usual suspects. It includes, economic development offices in the municipalities, because they have also their connections with the employer community. It means engaging with HR professionals who can help with that kind of assessment of the training needs and can provide the support for employers in order to implement some of these workforce development strategies. And obviously the education system in terms of both finding youth for jobs, but also to learn about what employers expect in terms of the job market. Opportunities for youth to get co-op placements and internships and summer jobs and work experiences. That's where we're going now in terms of our education system. It also has to become much more integrated with and kind of have a transition into the labor market. So all those things require convening and organizing and bringing together and a lot of talking in a way that speaks to a much more complex labor market than we ever had before. And employers are such an important part of this. We know that the employer has to be considered as a client as much as the participant who's looking for work. But it's the employer where a lot of the information is what are your skill needs? How do they change? What is the training for? Like, doing training in the abstract without engagement with employers is a waste of an effort. Like, we need to know what is the job that exists at the end of this training. And simply training people may also not be enough, because the workplace may need to change. That oftentimes we're talking about different procedures that are going to have that can only be applied by individuals who have the higher skills. Those procedures aren't currently in place. Those operational procedures, whether it's on a plant floor or in a store or in a restaurant, you can't up your game until you have the workers who have the skills, but there's no point giving those workers their skills if you don't up your game, right? So
chicken and egg.
Yeah. So you got to do both, and again, I think sometimes we look at some of these issues and think, well, we'll just put people in training programs, but no, it's the combination of the two, and it's the integration of what we're doing on the training side and what employers are doing to receive those workers. And this can operate at all levels. We're not just talking about training for higher skilled workers. We're talking about I know we've seen studies around for entry level workers that just even basic literacy skills improves their productivity, and there's a benefit and a return to employers. There's things to be done, as I said, in retail or in food services that can improve the services, whether it's customer service, but also just how the work is managed, that can benefit from operational changes and the training that supports that. So I just want to kind of really make that pitch that the engagement of the employers is really important. So I guess in the end, the point I'm making is that wages don't increase just because we think it's a good idea. That wages increase because of productivity increases. It's because something's done better, something's done faster, cheaper. And that usually depends on training, or it depends on operational changes that need to be supported by training. Similarly, if we're talking about shortages of workers and we have to seek out new populations that perhaps don't have that same engagement with the labor market, that transition is a training issue. So for me, it's all around training, but it's got to be targeted. It's got to be respond to a market need, and there's got to be a job at the end of that training. So I guess at the end of the day, I do think there are solutions to the wage challenges. I think the fact that we have historically seen relatively flat wages in a lot of categories is a reflection of the fact that we actually haven't been investing in training in the way we used to, partly because we started adopting a view that maintaining costs lower and responding to kind of the immediate short-term thinking did not put us in a position to think about the long term and what the long-term health of a company and of an economy was, and that's the answer.
And a complicated answer it is as well too. And I think that, and there was also sort of an expectation too that the employers would own their own upgrading and training as well too. That became part of that cost-saving mentality, I think. That's
right. Yeah, because certainly 30 or 40 years ago, you could expect to come into an entry-level job and over time work your way up. And now employers seem to be hiring just in time. They're not looking about what your maybe future potential is as much as they're meeting an immediate need. And they expect that preparation for employment is someone else's responsibility. Right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Very complicated. Now, do you continue to see wages staying frozen, or what's your expectation of what may happen?
Well, it is interesting that as the unemployment rate has been going down, we have been seeing in at least certainly a number of studies. I know there was a recent study from I think it was believed the Development Bank of Canada had surveyed employers, and they were asking them how they were dealing with skill shortages and worker shortages, and I think around almost half, like something like 47%, said that they were increasing wages. So they are responding to that shortage issue. But again, even when they respond to that shortage issue, the money has to come from somewhere. And so, yes, I think wages are going to be increasing because we're going to start seeing labor shortages, or we are seeing labor shortages, but those wage increases are going to have to be sustained by productivity improvements.
That's right.
And that's where the training comes in. Yeah.
It's complicated.
Yeah.
It's very complicated, but a lot of what you said, I think the working together in a very methodical way is what we're seeing happen, and what we're going to need to see more of happening, just in terms of knowing that a lot of the unemployed do have barriers, or multiple barriers to employment. So thank you, Tom.
Yeah, pleasure.
This wraps up this edition of our workforce episodes. So I want to thank you, Tom, for sharing this expertise and insights with us. I want to remind you as well that our workforce webisodes are available anytime after the broadcast on our Simcoe Muskoka Workforce Development Board YouTube page. It'll also be on the website as well too, so you can click through there. You can watch them at a time that's convenient for you, or share them with your coworkers and friends, and we'd love for you to do that. Please watch for future workforce webisodes through our social media pages on LinkedIn and Twitter. There will be frequent announcements of when the next one is coming up and topics, etc. If you have an idea for a webisode, please get in touch with us through social media or on our website, which is www.smwdb.com. And thank you very much for being with us today.